How did the winter that Moscow once celebrated as its greatest ally turn into a silent executioner on the outskirts of Kupiansk? That single question now hangs over the Kharkiv front, because the reality unfolding there has shattered one of the Kremlin's oldest and most reliable myths. For decades, Russian military doctrine leaned on the idea of general winter, the belief that freezing temperatures would paralyze enemies and hand victory to Moscow almost automatically. Yet in Kupiansk, that narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence that no amount of propaganda could bury. What viewers must ask themselves early is this: if winter was supposed to guarantee Russian momentum, why is the battlefield telling such a different story? In late January, images circulated showing Ukrainian soldiers from the 13th National Guard Brigade raising the blue and yellow flag atop the Kupiansk City Council building. This was not symbolic theater. It was a visual refutation of claims made only days earlier by Russian officials that the city was fully under their control. While medals were being awarded in Moscow, the ground truth in Kupiansk exposed a widening gap between rhetoric and reality. According to statements from Ukrainian officers operating in the area, Russian forces inside the city were no longer functioning as a coherent unit. Instead of a continuous defensive line, what remained were scattered pockets of soldiers, often numbering fewer than 100, isolated from command and cut off from supplies. Many had retreated into basements and ruined industrial structures, relying on dwindling ammunition and radios rendered useless by dead batteries in sub-zero temperatures. These were not the conditions of a victorious occupying force, but the signs of an army losing control of time, space, and coordination. Western analysts following the Kharkiv sector noted that this breakdown was not sudden. Reuters and the BBC have repeatedly highlighted how Russian logistics struggled as winter deepened, with fuel deliveries delayed and rail links disrupted by Ukrainian strikes. Kupiansk, a critical railway junction, was supposed to anchor Russian supply routes toward Kharkiv. Instead, it became a choke point where pressure accumulated faster than Moscow could relieve it. Ukrainian drones maintained constant surveillance, turning movement into a risk and surrender into an impossibility for trapped Russian units. The Kremlin's insistence on portraying Kupiansk as secured served a strategic purpose beyond morale. Control of the city would have opened corridors toward Kharkiv itself, a prize that Russian planners hoped to threaten before spring. Yet winter, far from smoothing the path, magnified every weakness. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War observed that cold weather amplified logistical failures rather than compensating for them. Vehicles broke down more often, fuel consumption spiked, and troops lacking proper winter equipment faced exhaustion and frostbite at a pace that no rotation system could absorb. This reality has broader implications that extend beyond one city. With Donald Trump now back in the White House, NATO capitals are watching closely for signs that Russian winter offensives can still shift the strategic balance. So far, the lesson from Kupiansk is the opposite. Ukrainian forces, benefiting from Western-supplied surveillance technology and precision munitions, have adapted faster to winter conditions than their adversary. Thermal imaging turns snow-covered terrain into a liability for any force attempting large-scale movement without air and electronic dominance. The collapse of the winter myth at Kupiansk is therefore not merely a local embarrassment for Moscow. It is a warning sign. It suggests that Russia's ability to translate seasonal conditions into operational advantage has eroded under the combined pressure of Ukrainian adaptation and Western support. What once worked in the past no longer guarantees results in a war defined by drones, real-time intelligence, and fragile supply chains. Yet Kupiansk was only the opening crack, not the full rupture, because the situation inside the city pointed toward a much larger and more dangerous problem forming just beyond its frozen streets. Meanwhile, as attention focused on these isolated Russian groups, Analysts began to uncover evidence that entire formations nearby were sliding toward the same fate, raising the question of what would happen when isolation spread from battalions to armies. If Kupiansk exposed the collapse of a winter illusion, the situation inside the city revealed something even more unsettling. The Russian presence there was no longer an army in the conventional sense, but a collection of stranded survivors. What shocked analysts was not just that Russian troops were pushed back, but how completely their internal structure disintegrated once Ukrainian pressure intensified. The question that followed naturally was this: how does a force claiming control over a strategic hub end up fighting as isolated groups with no lifeline to command? Observers on the ground described a pattern repeated across Kupiansk's industrial districts. Russian soldiers, often 60 to 90 at a time, occupied basements, warehouses, and partially collapsed buildings, waiting out drone patrols overhead. Communication with higher command had largely ceased. Cold temperatures drained radio batteries within hours, while replacement equipment failed to arrive. Ammunition stocks thinned, food supplies dwindled, and wounded soldiers were left without evacuation routes. What remained of Russian control existed only on paper. Ukrainian forces treated these pockets not as frontline opponents, but as remnants to be cleared methodically. According to Ukrainian briefings cited by Defense News, and DW drones maintained constant observation, ensuring that any attempt to move or regroup was immediately detected. Mortars and precision strikes followed, turning each isolated shelter into a trap. Even surrender became nearly impossible as exposed movement across snow-covered streets invited instant engagement. Kupiansk, once advertised as a logistical prize, effectively turned into a containment zone for Russian losses. This fragmentation highlighted a deeper systemic failure. Military analysts in Western think tanks noted that Russian doctrine relies heavily on centralized command and steady resupply. Once those pillars collapse, units lack the autonomy and flexibility seen in Western-trained forces. In Kupiansk, this rigidity proved fatal. Without fuel deliveries, armored vehicles were abandoned. Without orders, junior officers hesitated to act. The city became a showcase of what happens when an army optimized for mass and momentum is forced into a battle of endurance and adaptation. Recent reporting by Reuters adds another layer to this picture. Ukrainian strikes against Russian energy infrastructure, particularly power substations and fuel depots deeper inside Russian territory, have compounded frontline shortages. Each successful attack reverberates forward, limiting the Kremlin's ability to sustain winter operations. What unfolds in Kupiansk is therefore not an isolated episode, but a downstream effect of a broader campaign targeting Russia's logistical backbone. From a NATO perspective, this matters profoundly. Western planners assess not only territorial changes, but also force cohesion. The breakdown seen in Kupiansk suggests that Russian units under pressure may collapse faster than expected once supply lines are threatened. This reinforces arguments in Washington and European capitals that continued support for Ukraine yields cumulative effects, weakening Russian capabilities beyond the immediate battlefield. With Donald Trump's administration emphasizing burden sharing within NATO, these developments feed into debates over how long Russia can sustain high-intensity operations without decisive breakthroughs. Yet the most alarming implication for Moscow lies ahead. Kupiansk demonstrated that isolation spreads quickly. What begins with scattered groups in a city can escalate into entire brigades, losing coherence if relief never comes. Analysts now warn that the same dynamics visible in Kupiansk are emerging along adjacent sectors where Russian formations face similar constraints under winter conditions and constant Ukrainian surveillance. What followed next shocked analysts even more, because evidence began to surface that this pattern of isolation was no longer confined to urban pockets. but was engulfing one of Russia's most prestigious formations, just beyond Kupiansk's frozen perimeter. How does an elite formation designed to spearhead Russia's most critical operations end up immobilized in the snow, unable to maneuver or even retreat in an orderly fashion? That question now defines the fate of the 1st Guards Tank Army, once regarded as the Kremlin's armored fist and a symbol of military prestige since Soviet times. What analysts uncovered near Kharkiv suggests that this force tasked with protecting Moscow itself has been drawn into a trap from which its traditional strengths offer little escape. The 1st Guards Tank Army entered the war with roughly 50,000 personnel modernized T-90M tanks and officers selected from Russia's most experienced cadres. Its mission near Kharkiv was clear: apply pressure along the northern axis, threaten key transport nodes, and create leverage against Ukrainian defenses. Yet by mid-January, intelligence assessments cited by Western outlets indicated that its combat effectiveness had been reduced by roughly half. Instead of an unstoppable armored mass, the army had become a sluggish formation, struggling to keep vehicles operational in -20-degree conditions. Fuel shortages emerged as the most immediate constraint. Reports from Defense News and Military Watch magazine described columns of armored vehicles unable to advance because diesel deliveries failed to arrive on time. Cold weather thickened fuel lines, engines stalled, and maintenance crews lacked spare parts. Each breakdown forced commanders to make a choice: abandon equipment or risk exposure while attempting recovery under Ukrainian drone surveillance. In practice, many vehicles were simply left behind, frozen monuments to a doctrine that assumed logistics would always follow. Personnel conditions deteriorated just as quickly. Soldiers rotated through frontline positions with insufficient rest, lacking proper winter gear and heated shelters. Frostbite cases increased according to Ukrainian intelligence summaries, while morale declined as rumors spread that relief units were not coming. Western analysts pointed out that losing half of a formation's effective strength is widely regarded in military literature as equivalent to removal from the fight. Yet Moscow continued to issue orders as if the army remained intact. Why persist with such pressure? Observers argue that political imperatives played a decisive role. With Donald Trump back in the Oval Office, Kremlin strategists may have hoped to demonstrate momentum before any recalibration of Western policy could take effect. Showing gains near Kharkiv would signal resilience and deter additional NATO support for Ukraine. Instead, the opposite occurred. The more the 1st Guards Tank Army was pushed, the more visible its limitations became. The Institute for the Study of War documented a sharp decline in Russian territorial gains during this period. After a brief surge in December, advances slowed dramatically by the end of the year and nearly stalled in early January. This trend, analysts emphasized, reflected not a pause but exhaustion. Reserves had been committed too early, fuel stocks were depleted, and the cold magnified every inefficiency. The army designed to exploit breakthroughs found itself pinned down, unable to exploit anything at all. From a NATO standpoint, the implications are significant. The erosion of an elite Russian formation challenges assumptions about Moscow's remaining strategic reserves. If the 1st Guards Tank Army cannot operate effectively under winter conditions with priority access to equipment, questions arise about the readiness of other formations facing similar constraints. In Washington, policy circles increasingly frame this as evidence that sustained pressure rather than rapid escalation yields strategic dividends. Yet this crisis did not end with stalled tanks and exhausted troops. What followed next shocked analysts even further, because commanders responded not by pulling back to regroup, but by adopting a desperate workaround that shifted the burden of failure onto the infantry themselves. What happens when armored power becomes too risky to deploy, and commanders still demand progress at any cost? The answer emerging from the frozen fields north of Kharkiv is as stark as it is disturbing. Russian units, stripped of mobility and fearful of losing their remaining tanks, shifted toward a method that analysts describe as operational desperation rather than strategy. The early question confronting observers is unavoidable when machines fail, who pays the price? The pattern became clear through battlefield reports, cited by the Institute for the Study of War and reinforced by coverage from Defense News and Al Jazeera. Russian commanders increasingly avoided sending tanks and armored vehicles forward, knowing that thermal sensors and precision-guided munitions made them visible targets against snow-covered terrain. Engines glowing in sub-zero conditions betrayed positions instantly. Losing a modern tank was not only a tactical setback, but a political liability, one that officers feared explaining up the chain of command. Instead, infantry units were ordered forward on foot. This approach, sometimes labeled infiltration operations in official language, translated on the ground into forced marches across open terrain under constant surveillance. Soldiers carried heavy loads through knee-deep snow, advancing kilometers without armored support. By the time they reached Ukrainian positions, exhaustion had already stripped them of combat effectiveness. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold, and communication devices failed within minutes as batteries drained. Military analysts in Western capitals have been blunt in their assessments. Reuters quoted defense experts describing these advances as unsustainable, noting that infantry-only assaults against prepared positions are costly even under favorable conditions. In winter, with drones overhead and artillery calibrated by real-time intelligence, such tactics verge on self-destruction. Ukrainian forces equipped with Western-supplied thermal optics and sheltered firing positions often detected these movements long before contact occurred. A striking example unfolded north of Kharkiv in mid-January, when a group of roughly 70 Russian soldiers attempted to probe Ukrainian defenses. The mission reportedly aimed to identify weak points rather than seize territory. Yet drones spotted the movement almost immediately. Mortar fire followed, then precision strikes. Snipers eliminated survivors attempting to retreat. By the end of the engagement, the unit ceased to exist, and the front line remained unchanged. These losses did more than thin Russian ranks. They accelerated fractures within the force. Reports emerged of refusals to advance and outright desertions in neighboring sectors. Western analysts linked this to declining trust between soldiers and commanders. When troops perceive orders as expendable lives rather than achievable missions, cohesion erodes rapidly. This dynamic, once confined to irregular units, now appeared within formations previously regarded as disciplined and loyal. The broader strategic impact extends beyond the battlefield. For NATO planners, the reliance on infantry death marches underscores a shift in Russian operational calculus driven by scarcity. Fuel shortages, maintenance failures, and fear of equipment losses combine to push risk downward onto personnel. In Washington, where Donald Trump's administration continues to emphasize measurable outcomes in aid and deterrence policy, such developments are scrutinized as indicators of Russian sustainability under pressure. Energy infrastructure strikes deep inside Russia at another dimension. As Ukrainian attacks disrupt refineries and power nodes, the ripple effects reach frontline logistics. Each damaged facility reduces Moscow's margin for recovery, tightening constraints that already limit mobility and supply. Analysts warn that unless conditions change, the cycle of infantry-led assaults will continue compounding losses without delivering strategic gains. Yet the consequences of this doctrine extend far beyond tactical failures. What followed next shocked analysts most, because the human cost of these decisions began to reverberate back toward Moscow itself, threatening political stability as well as military effectiveness. When battlefield losses begin to echo inside a nation's economy, wars enter a far more dangerous phase. That is the stage Russia now appears to be approaching, as the strain from Kharkiv and Kupiansk ripples outward into Moscow's financial and political core. The immediate question analysts began asking was no longer about territory, but endurance. How long can a state absorb simultaneous military attrition and economic contraction without something giving way? Recent financial data examined by Western economists and reported by Reuters and the Financial Times paint a troubling picture. Russia's federal budget deficit widened sharply through the past year, far beyond what officials initially described as manageable. Independent forecasts now suggest that by the end of the coming year, the gap could expand to levels unseen since the immediate post-Soviet era. The cost of sustaining large formations at the front, particularly under winter conditions, has surged while revenue streams shrink at the same time. Energy remains the central pressure point. Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil refineries, power substations, and fuel depots have multiplied according to assessments cited by Defense News and Al Jazeera. These attacks do not merely create temporary outages, they disrupt export capacity insurance coverage and long-term infrastructure reliability. Every damaged facility reduces the flow of funds that Moscow relies on to finance both its military and domestic stability. Analysts estimate that energy revenues, once the backbone of Russia's war chest, have fallen by roughly 1/3 compared to previous years. This financial squeeze directly affects the front lines. Fuel shortages reported around Kharkiv are not isolated logistical mishaps, but symptoms of a system under stress. When oil and gas income declines, replenishing stocks becomes harder, transportation budgets tighten, and priority allocations spark competition between regions and units. Western military experts argue that the immobilization of armored formations is as much an economic failure as a tactical one. Inside Russia, the social consequences are becoming harder to obscure. Inflation has climbed into double-digit territory, eroding purchasing power for ordinary citizens. Families of soldiers face rising costs while coping with mounting casualties and delayed compensation payments. Analysts from European think tanks warn that such pressures undermine the Kremlin's narrative that the conflict remains distant from everyday life. History suggests that wars often falter not when armies lose battles, but when societies lose patience. From a NATO perspective, this convergence of military and economic strain carries strategic significance. Policymakers in Washington and European capitals view Russia's budgetary stress as a limiting factor on long-term escalation. With Donald Trump now overseeing U.S. policy debates within the alliance, increasingly focus on sustainability, whether continued support for Ukraine accelerates a point at which Moscow must choose between domestic stability and prolonged war. The evidence from Russia's financial indicators strengthens arguments that time favors Ukraine and its backers. Yet Moscow's response to these pressures has not been de-escalation. Instead, officials continue to project confidence, drawing down reserve funds to cover immediate needs. Economists caution that these reserves are finite. Once depleted, options narrow rapidly, forcing either drastic spending cuts or deeper monetization of deficits, both of which carry political risks. The decision to trade future stability for present operations mirrors the battlefield choice to sacrifice infantry to preserve equipment. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the feedback loop now forming. Economic weakness constrains military effectiveness, which in turn generates further losses, increasing costs, and public discontent. Analysts describe this as a spiral that becomes harder to reverse with each turn. The winter campaign, intended to demonstrate resilience, has instead highlighted vulnerability at multiple levels of the state. Yet this unfolding crisis is not the final chapter. What followed next shocked analysts even more, because signs began to emerge that the cumulative pressure of military failure and economic strain could reshape Russia's strategic posture in ways that extend far beyond the current front lines. Could this winter mark the moment when Russia's campaign shifts from grinding persistence to irreversible decline? That question now dominates discussions among military and economic analysts as the combined weight of battlefield failures and financial strain converges. The events around Kupiansk and Kharkiv are no longer viewed as isolated setbacks, but as indicators of a broader structural problem that winter conditions have exposed rather than concealed. Strategically, the loss of momentum carries consequences that reach beyond Ukraine's borders. NATO planners assess not only Russia's current posture, but its ability to regenerate combat power. The degradation of elite formations combined with shrinking fiscal space limits Moscow's options. According to assessments cited by the Institute for the Study of War and echoed in Western defense circles, Russia is increasingly forced into short-term choices that trade long-term capability for immediate appearances of control. This is not a sustainable posture for a prolonged conflict. Ukraine's evolving strategy amplifies these pressures. Western intelligence reporting highlights how Kyiv has synchronized frontline operations with strikes against energy infrastructure inside Russia. Each attack on a refinery or power node reverberates through logistics networks, reducing the resources available to stabilize fronts like Kharkiv. Defense news analysts emphasize that this approach targets the war's enabling systems rather than its symbols, gradually constricting Russia's operational oxygen. In winter, when demand for fuel peaks, such disruptions carry outsized impact. The political dimension further complicates Moscow's calculations. With Donald Trump now and the White House, European allies face renewed debates over burden sharing and defense readiness. Yet the evidence from the battlefield strengthens arguments for continued coordination. If Russian forces struggle to maintain cohesion under sustained pressure, policymakers reason the alliance's unified approach remains a decisive factor. The collapse of the winter offensive myth reinforces confidence that support for Ukraine yields cumulative strategic results rather than fleeting gains. Internally, Russia confronts a narrowing set of choices. Drawing down reserve funds may buy time, but economists warn that doing so accelerates exposure to inflation and social unrest. The strain on military families, rising consumer prices, and visible battlefield losses erode the credibility of official narratives. Analysts note that regimes rarely fall because of a single defeat. Rather, they falter when losses become routine and explanations lose plausibility. Winter intended to project strength has instead magnified fragility. Looking ahead, several scenarios emerge. One possibility is continued attrition with Moscow relying on manpower to compensate for material shortages, prolonging the conflict at high human cost. Another is a strategic pause forced by economic realities rather than battlefield choice. A third, more destabilizing outcome involves internal fractures widening as elite units fail and public patience wears thin. None of these options promise a return to the confidence projected at the war's outset. For NATO and Western policymakers, the coming months will test assumptions about deterrence and endurance. The experience of this winter suggests that time, when combined with targeted pressure, may be a decisive variable. Whether Moscow adapts or doubles down remains uncertain, but the trajectory revealed around Kupiansk points toward diminishing returns. What followed next may determine not only the next phase of the war, but the strategic balance in Europe itself, leaving observers to ask whether this winter represents a temporary setback for Russia or the beginning of a deeper reckoning.